Us for getting caught sometimes by surprise. But yes, here we are. Welcome to Q&A, and I hope that you come with questions. So just a reminder, send your questions in on Facebook as quickly as possible, please.
And I'll get on Facebook as quickly as possible.
There you go. And Jo will herself try to get prepared in some form or fashion.
I was trying to get lunch ready, and anyway.
She was trying to get lunch ready. I was taking a nap. We all have our roles to play. So, thank you so much for joining us. And the questions, of course, today we went through Esther chapter 3. And so if you have any questions related specifically to that, feel free to send those in. And otherwise, if you're just questions in general, personal questions, theology questions, anything, let us know.
You missed it. The very first screenshot of it when it pops up is me going,
oh, that's hilarious. Maybe that'll be the, Facebook just chooses a picture to show as the kind of the screenshot for the video. Maybe that'll be the screenshot. That'll be great. I'll love that. If it does, I'm gonna be sure to send that to all our friends just to make the most of that moment.
I'm having sparkling water while it's still sunny outside because I think it's supposed to be turning cold.
Yes. So hopefully after the Q&A today, not until after that, but after the Q&A, hopefully then you get outside and enjoy some pretty weather today. So ask me a question,
the
Jo.
message today
Yeah.
was very good.
Well, thank you.
And there was a part in there where I thought, when you were comparing us, you were saying that we are...
Haman is like Satan.
Right.
We are like Xerxes.
We are like Xerxes, and you gave the example of us being like him in that what selfish things, can we do or whatever.
When Satan appeals to our vanity or
and
whatever.
I thought maybe you could tell because nobody's gonna, some of us may, but it can be sneakier than that, not always.
Yeah.
What selfish, what can please myself, but sometimes it's more subtle ways.
Yeah.
Oftentimes it's more subtle ways.
It reminds me of a friend of mine, actually, I think I can't remember which friend it was. I think it was a fellow pastor was admitting, for instance, how he had always made fun of, scoffed at the idea of parents who get over competitive about their kids, whether I think it was sports, but really regardless of the venue, academics, sports, whatever. And he said, and now I'm having to discover that I have to rely on the Lord every day to keep from doing that myself, Yeah. So because you want to live vicariously through your kids, or you want your kids to succeed in ways that, you're hoping that they'll be amazing violinist or amazing baseball player, amazing,
whatever,
straight A student, whatever. And so it's so easy to sacrifice your kids in the end, though, on the altar of some kind of success, some kind of worldly success. And that's not to say, so I always feel like we have to qualify everything, because that's not to say that it's wrong to have straight A's as a kid, or have a high standard.
And it's a good thing to practice your instrument every day and to do it to the very best of your ability.
The Bible says, whatever your hand finds to do, do it to the glory of God, right?
Yeah,
so everything we do, we should be striving for excellence. But we're doing those things, the Bible also says, whether you're eating or drinking or whatever you're doing, do to the glory of God. And it's very easy to just say, well, we're doing excellence for the glory of God, and in fact you're just doing excellence in order for your own vanity, selfishness, or desire for your kids to succeed or whatever. And so that's just one example of how we can give into this this subtle trap of Satan appeals to our vanity in some form or fashion, to our greed in some form or fashion. We can easily hand over the signet ring and say, oh, well, it's necessary for my kids to miss church in order to pursue this, this sports opportunity. It's necessary for my kids to, never be able to have a meal together in the have family devotions because it means we're so busy doing this. That's worth it.
Yeah.
So it's easy to hand over the signet ring because something appeals to your vanity or whatever.
And I thought it was interesting the comment you made about like making sure that you have counselors, but making sure they're good counselors, because sometimes even in our good counselors, we can pick the ones.
Yeah.
So say, I'm trying to think of something, and it's so delicate because I'm not.
It's
I'm
so
just
hard.
going to use homeschooling as an example, but not because I feel like. So this is something that I wrestle with. So that's why I'm not saying everybody should be homeschooling or everybody should be doing private Christian or everybody should be doing public schooling. I think, But anyway, for example. I homeschool because I feel like it's the best thing for our kids right now, but it's not because I love it. Like I'm just not a natural, like today kids we're gonna learn about, like I'm just not a natural homeschooler. So it would be an easy temptation for me to find all of the people that maybe aren't wrestling with that conviction for their families, because every family dynamic is different. Maybe they have their kids enrolled in the private Christian school that is within their budget, and their circumstances make it so that that's the best situation for them, instead of me maybe going to the person that's homeschooling.
Yes.
I might pick that person as my counselor, even though they're both godly individuals and both people that you would seek counsel from. In the back of your mind, you can carefully select. And it's kind of that same idea that you were talking about, appeasing your, making you feel better.
You know who the people are who might give you affirmation, at least in that area.
Yeah.
That's
so
exactly
I just was thinking of those things when you were talking. It's not always like, who will make me feel like I'm the best. It's like, who will tell me
what I want to hear.
What I want to hear in this particular situation, even though one answer or the other may not be an evil in itself, but maybe it's going against what God has for you in your life. So that's just
on the other hand, it is like this happened this week. I was just telling Cho, I've been really wrestling with this decision about whether we should move forward on something. I've been really wrestling with it. I'd even sort of thrown out feelers to different people trying to get some kind of like, what would you do in this situation, and just all over the board kind of feedback and
asking for a friend.
Yeah. I'm asking for a friend. What would you do in this situation? And then this week, I was just talking to somebody, and they were like, you should do that. Like, they were just very, cut and clear, decisive, which is what I needed. And they listed all the reasons that I knew were true. And then I was like, oh, yeah, that's helpful.
Yeah.
So it's amazing how sometimes, just getting a diversity of counselors. But sometimes somebody will tell you what you kind of feel like you maybe should know and are not sure if you should know it.
Yeah, God certainly uses other people.
Absolutely, other voices to speak into your life.
Truth and to help you discern, I think. Because a lot of times God is telling you something and we're just not listening. Yeah. And sometimes He uses other people to help us discern what His will is. We've got some questions,
okay,
so
great.
I'm going to cut you off. Mordecai experienced pressure from his peers to compromise in not bowing to Haman. In the same way, a believer might be singled out for making a godly stand on principle. If this was what Mordecai was doing, what should we do if we find ourselves in such a situation?
That's a very good question, and particularly, I'm sorry I can't help but personally, this is the sphere I'm living in right now. Is the milieu of decision making in relation to COVID, right?
Yeah.
Everybody has different opinions, and I'm not down on any of those.
Yeah.
In some ways, we probably have strong opinions. I don't know, but anyway, so everybody has strong opinions, and some people are making a stand for their conviction in relation to COVID, whatever it is. And on either side, making a stand, making sure that we go and tell people that they ought to be doing this, or making sure we go and tell people that we ought not to be doing this, whatever it is. And so I think one area is to be careful that whatever we're making a stand on, that we're prioritizing the level of importance, even in our own mind. Like, is this a gospel issue? Is this something that should we be willing to divide the church over, or and by the way, that should only be a gospel issue, right? It shouldn't be an issue of, whether you're wearing masks or any number of other things that musical preferences. Those are not things to divide any church ever over, because that is not that's not a primary issue. That's not a gospel issue. Jesus desires, and he prays in John 17, that we will all be one. And so that has to be our driving heart. That has to be our motivation. If at all possible, we need to be one. And so that kind of stand, it's okay to make a stand in the sense of, well, I'm going to act according to my convictions, but you have to be careful that you're not, erring off to one side of making a mountain out of a molehill doctrinally. But if it is a gospel issue, say, something that comes up at work that they're requiring you to do, and everybody else is, is bowing down to the idol, basically. You're Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and everybody else is bowing to the idol. And there's a lot of those kind of idols, a lot of those tests being set out in the workplace these days.
Yeah.
Then all I can say, one, is God is sympathetic to your challenges. I was just reading this week in the Gospels, and Jesus is very sympathetic to the challenge that we will have when we stand before rulers and things. And he says to the apostles even, don't try to think up all your answers beforehand. The Spirit will give you strength. And that was really comforting to me to just recognize that God knows, like, the challenge of, like, staying up all night worrying before you face Nero,
Yeah.
And he was like, don't worry, I'll be with you, That's beautiful. But also, the remember, you're not alone. You may be a minority as a Christian in a secular world, but there are other Christians. And Satan wants us to feel like we're alone.
Yeah.
We're the only ones who are acting according to conviction. We're the only ones who are trying to, raise our kids in the right way or stand for these truths. And we're not. Other Christians are out there. And so I would say, on one hand, remember that God is sympathetic to your situation. Secondly, you're not alone, and reach out to other Christians and get that support and get that counsel, because maybe a Christian could help you think through, is there a way that you have to die on this hill at work, or is there a way that perhaps you could not compromise your conviction and still keep your job,
Yeah.
So those are helpful things.
Yeah.
But that's a hard question, obviously, so I'm not pretending to answer every issue there. Sorry, you're obviously, whatever somebody wrote, you're over here cracking up.
That's the next one, so I'll do this one. And I wondered this too, where did Haman get all that money to give King Xerxes?
Yeah, that is a good question. I almost
I think he was corrupt.
I almost made a smirky comment about it even during the sermon, like, you have to wonder if this guy, Xerxes was by this point so clearly hands off in the leadership. You almost wonder if, ironically, you almost wonder, is Haman giving this money from Xerxes' treasures? Where is he getting this, right?
Yeah.
It is also very likely, very possible, of course, that a ruler of that status, he had already been, granted enormous amount of power, enormous amount of money. But even then, it's kind of like, you're giving back to me the money that I gave you. So
yeah, I think he was embezzling money.
So yeah, you have to wonder if he's like Judas, right? And he's like taking the money. And so
there's no biblical.
Yeah, the Bible doesn't say, but boy, you sure do speculate when it comes to Haman that somebody that wicked, there's just no end to the possible deceit.
Okay, so here's the one I was giggling at, is just wondering, are you against the wearing of crosses? Thank you for the wonderful sermon, by the way. And I'm only giggling because there is that one that you might be related to that wears the cross necklace, and I said that to him. I don't want to say who it is, but you know who I'm talking about.
Oh, you're talking about somebody specific?
Yeah, and I was glad that you came full circle around, because I thought, it reminded me one time, my sister had not been going to church in forever, and then one time she came to visit, she came to church, and this guy got up and was going on and on and on about wearing a cross necklace, and it's like, you might as well be wearing an
electric
chair or something, and she was wearing, did I already say that? She was wearing a little cross necklace, and it was awful. Yeah. Anyway, so I'm glad that he got around to saying, you're not wearing a cross of execution, with Jesus on it. You're wearing a cross as a symbol of victory.
Yeah.
Um,
So to answer the question very simply, I'm 100% in favor of crosses across the
Yeah.
board. Put them on the steeple,
Yeah.
wear them on your neck, wear a T-shirt with it on it,
Yeah.
put it on your car, bumper sticker.
I like the ichthus too.
Yeah, the ichthus, all of that is beautiful
Yeah.
because it all is just a symbol of. I'm actually glorying in the fact, in this message that we were just talking about, I'm glorying in the fact that what was a symbol of destruction, which was the very lot that was cast poor, that was cast for their destruction, they made a feast called Feast of Purim. In other words, they made a feast named after the die that had declared they were all going to die on such and such a day.
Yeah.
And that's a beautiful thing, how God turns our beauty into ashes. I mean, our ashes brings beauty out of ashes. He turns our most horrible situations. We look back and say, and the beautiful thing is you can see that in all kinds of things. I mean, of course, in our adoption story,
Yeah.
unbelievable grief that
Preceded it.
Yeah, that precedes.
And was mixed in.
Of
there
course,
all the
absolutely,
way,
every step of the way.
Yeah.
Unbelievable grief and loss and pain and dark caves of discouragement that you feel like there's no light at the end of the tunnel or anything, and then God brings something beautiful. I'm not saying He does that in everybody's situation.
No.
In relation to somehow you
Yeah.
end up with adoption, but I'm just saying everybody can look at your life and you can see areas where God made something beautiful, and like the very thing that you're grieving over, you're now rejoicing over.
Yeah. Well, for instance, with regard to that, because I always have this thing with Christian movies where
Right.
they're always, oh, this is so horrible. In the end, everybody gets a brand new car, and they've been struggling with infertility for years, and then they're expecting twins, and it's a little frustrating because
That's not how
it's
life
not
is.
how life is,
Right.
and so just want to be careful to stay with those years of infertility, the 9 years of not having kids. Part of the beauty that He gave us for ashes was 9 years of not having children. It wasn't, the having kids wasn't the only beautiful part of the story. And so take heart, struggling Christian, if you're wrestling with something, the beauty and the joy isn't always necessarily found in the answer the way you think it should be.
In fact, almost.
Right.
That's the beauty of it.
Right.
It's something that you can't see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You may not ever have biological kids, or we had 9 years of being able to have youth in our home, and just opportunities that we would not have had if we had 4 little kids running around the house. And so there was beauty in that. So just want to throw that out there, just in case somebody is wrestling and
Yes, that's
expecting the answer to be a certain thing.
And it's also important to say that there are things in our life that we still don't, and really truly I don't expect ever to see, like in this life, to say,
Why did that happen?
say that was awesome. There's things that will give us pain forever and ever.
Yeah.
It's just every time you think about it, it's not going to be like, oh, that was wonderful. It's painful.
Yeah.
But God does promise to do that.
Works.
Yeah. Patience, that's right. Patience works experience, and experience hope. And so therefore you kind of learn over the course of numerous trials that nothing lasts forever. Even pain and death doesn't last forever.
Yeah,
so
but the refining is a gift.
Yeah, that's right. But
which doesn't sound comforting when you're right in the middle.
No, I know it sounds awful, and it feels awful.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one of the things I loved when I was going through one trial. I was reading the book of Hebrews, and I was so comforted by the fact that he says, no trial when you're going through it feels good. And I was like, oh, thank you,
Lord.
Thank
you for acknowledging
Yes,
that.
thank you for just acknowledging that, because I don't care if it worked. I mean, I do care, but I'm saying even if it does work out great 10 years from now, it hurts right now really bad. And so for him to just acknowledge that, the Word of God to acknowledge that is very, very empathetic. So anyway, I forgot where all we were going there, but
we got carried away.
Yeah. Oh yeah, cross.
Sorry.
Okay, that was crazy.
Yeah.
Okay, crosses. Yes, I'm in favor of crosses. But I mean, I'm in favor. The beautiful thing is, you may have something. Here's a perfect example. It may not be a cross. Someone gave us a little ornament, a little Christmas ornament, when we were going through the adoption process, trying to get a 4th child. and they gave us a little ornament. It was a loved one, a family member gave us a little ornament. Said we're praying for you and all this. And for years, we never hung that ornament on the tree because we weren't. There was no baby, and it was like don't get me wrong, it was a super thoughtful thing, and it never hurt us that they gave it to us,
No.
but it wasn't like an occasion for rejoicing. And then
Like 7 years later.
7 years later, when we have Eva and we brought her home, then we're hanging this thing on the tree for the first time, and it almost just overwhelms you to think,
Well, 'cause
wow, we've had this ornament forever.
Yeah, and the coloring of the ornament
Right,
looks
yeah.
like Eva.
It does
Like,
look
it's
like
just
Eva. Yeah, which
really
is cool.
sweet.
Yeah. So anyway, that ornament was kind of an example of a little kind of cross kind of thing. I mean, a very micro level, but still, I mean, an example of
a
how
testament of God's
of
goodness.
how it becomes an emblem of beauty and answer to
Yeah.
prayer. So anything like that, it doesn't have to just be in the case of the cross, but the cross is the ultimate example,
Yeah.
and that is that God in Jesus overcame everything wicked, everything bad, everything that would damn us to hell forever, and He overcame all of it, and in turn turned it to our salvation.
I know.
So it's the best news ever. The worst news ever became the best news ever. I was just reading the Gospels, and we're talking about Jesus walking along with the guys on the road to Emmaus, and I was just so sympathetic to these guys. Like, when Jesus asked them, why are you down? They said, are you the only... I mean, this is such a funny kind of answer. They must have just been really down. They're like, are you the only stranger in Jerusalem that isn't down? Like, what's wrong with you? What do you mean, what are we down? Haven't you heard any of the news? It's so funny that not funny, but it's very
Relatable.
real. It's
Yeah.
very relatable that they're like, what do you mean? What are you talking about? And Jesus then takes them through the whole Old Testament and says, didn't you understand this is the way things had to be? It's just beautiful. So he does this over and over again, but the cross is the ultimate example.
Yeah. Really sweet thing that you did. I forgot to tell you in church, but when you were wrapping up and you were sort of laying out, where is your hope? And you painted this horrible, are you outside of Jesus thing? And Eva next to me started singing "No Victory in Jesus."
Are you
It
serious?
was so sweet.
That is beautiful.
Yeah,
That
before you
girl,
got to the good part. So
she
anyway,
is so good. I
yeah.
love her.
I don't know. I just had to tell you that. But let me get back to this.
We're
Okay.
pretty sure Eva's already saved. I mean, she just...
Sometimes, yeah. There were some we were pretty sure they weren't. But every now and then
But Eva
Yeah.
just, man, she responds to the gospel so sincerely.
it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
We'll just continue to pray to that end.
Amen.
Okay, with respect to giving our signet ring, in the case where a Christian, it just moved. In the case where a Christian supports a group that is in agreement of a particular moral issue, but the group hates God, are we in effect giving our ring to them in the style of Xerxes?
Oh, great question. Great question.
Yeah, that is a
Man,
good question.
let me say this. I think one of the things. So, for instance, I don't know what all this person asking the question. Great question, by the way. Again, but I don't know what all you have in mind. But my mind immediately goes to political parties. And right now in America, I'm not as familiar with the scene here in Canada, but I imagine the same basic scenarios playing out. And that is that right now, I think in the past, Americans, in the past as in, 50, 100 years ago or whatever, there was this choice between, sometimes, there was a choice between two moral candidates or whatever, two guys that you could make an argument for or whatever.
Right.
And now it's almost like it's flipped, and you can easily see how a Christian would be uncomfortable voting for either person. And yet is the only option therefore not to vote because you can't vote for like a godly person? Because I think it's fair to say neither of the people representing the two major parties in America are Christians. Their life and their affirmations and everything else are not Christian. And so, but the interesting thing is Christians around the globe, I think, must be a little impatient with that challenge, because they have been all along having to make this decision. I mean, it's not as if in India, for example, I have a dear friend who pastors in India. He is from India, and they vote for the candidate who is. They know they're not going to have a Christian candidate. I mean, Christian is like less than 3% of the population, so they're not even expecting to have a Christian candidate. They know that there's going to be a certain amount of corruption. They know there's going to be sinfulness in the process, but they're just voting for the person that they feel is going to, best represent Christian interests and Christian values and so on, even recognizing that they're going to do that maybe just not at all out of conviction, but just maybe, as an aside or whatever. And so in other words, I mean, all the rest of the world has wrestled with this for generations. It's like America and Canada, I think, maybe are just more recent on the scene. But in other words, it's okay to vote for somebody and perhaps even in some sense to campaign for somebody when you're simply campaigning for this set of values versus this set of values, this platform versus this platform, even if one platform is very faulty. In other words, it's not like you're going for the perfect platform either, because there won't be such a thing. And so just recognizing sometimes you are absolutely choosing the best of two evils. I mean, that's certainly the case. I mean, that's, again, almost universally across the board been the case otherwise. When it comes to an organization, similarly, what I would say is if you have opportunity to clarify what things you agree with an organization about versus disagree with an organization about, I think that is wise. But can you give financially, for example, to a secular organization who probably has zero Christian interest in whatever they're doing, but is combating homelessness downtown? Sure, you can still support that good effort even if the organization itself isn't Christian per se in its values. Now, if you have the choice between that organization and a Christian organization who is sharing the gospel with the homeless downtown and trying to help them physically, you might want to think about, which one better to spend your money. But the point is you can support things in some sense that aren't entirely Christian, because even when you do come to Christian issues, a lot of times Christians aren't going to agree with you on everything even. So no matter what you're supporting, in some sense you're always supporting with qualifications. You're always saying, I support them in this way, not in this way. But it is good to express that. I support them in this way, not in this way, and that way you're making clear what you're approving of. But it's super challenging, and I recognize it's a delicate and difficult question.
Sorry if I seem distracted.
No,
I was remembering an article that I read this week, the single issue voting. I couldn't remember if it was Al Mohler or if it was Gospel Coalition, but I think I just found it. Did you read that one?
No, I haven't.
Okay, well, I don't know if it's relevant, but these two things that are almost always true. Everyone is a single issue voter and no one is a single issue voter.
Yeah.
And it's talking about abortion and the election, but I think there might be some relevance there that parallels that you could tie in.
Yeah, I'll go back in.
Or I have to read through it again to see if it is relevant, or it may be too politically. There's some great.
But we might tack that onto the question if it's relevant.
Yeah, and there's some great Gospel Coalition articles, but I couldn't remember where I found it.
Yeah,
okay,
that's helpful. And great question again, thanks.
Yeah. We have a lot more. I'm so sorry I spent all that time. In Esther 3:2 it says, and all the king's servants that were in the king's gates bowed and reverenced Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai bows not did him reverence.
Did not do him reverence,
yeah. It doesn't. Okay, so maybe the next one is, so when Mordecai didn't revere Haman, wasn't he disobeying the king?
Yes, he was. Yeah. And that's exactly, I can't remember if I said this specifically or not, but there's a valid argument to be made that Mordecai was wrong in disobeying the king. Did he have to die on that hill? I think that, I tend to think that, again, that if you're a Jew, which is who this is written to, if you're a Jew reading this story, I think you immediately pick up on the fact that Haman is an Amalekite. Like, that's not something you have to point out to a Jew, and they're like, oh yeah, and that's why. So I think that's the obvious explanation. I shouldn't say obvious, but the most obvious explanation. But it is possible that he sort of was being civilly disobedient and maybe brought some trouble on himself. But
or maybe the most logical deduction that you could make for his.
Yeah, I think it's in the text suggested maybe so.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is possible that he could have been wrong. It's a difficult thing because all the king's guards were doing that, but I mean they're all pagans, so that doesn't necessarily mean that they were doing the right thing. And again, Mordecai is bowing down to Xerxes. He's there's no indication that he's just in general disrespectful of authority. So it seems like there's something about Haman that he's zeroing in on, and it would seem that it's probably that he's an Amalekite. But it is possible that he was just, didn't want to bow down to a pagan authority and got in trouble for it. And yeah. Good question, by the way. That is something Bible students, go back and forth a little bit on.
Last week, when examining Xerxes and his gathering of a harem, it seems similar to Solomon and some other Jewish kings. Mm-hmm. Were they different?
Yeah, good question. So it's interesting you asked that. One of the things that God warns Israel about when they say, we want a king, we want to be like all the other nations, we want to, have a visible king. I mean, because think about it. The one form of government that God has ever fully approved is a theocracy, which is God over everybody directly. And that's what Israel had. They had a theocracy where God ruled directly. God through Moses spoke to the entire nation. That's like the best. That's as good as it gets. So that's what they had, but they didn't want it because they looked around and all these other nations have like physical kings, and that seemed more fun. And so they, were complaining to God, give us a king, give us a king. And God warns them and says, if you get a king, the king is going to draft your kids into the army. The king is going to, he kind of warns, I don't know if he doesn't use the word harem, but he basically is like, your sons and daughters are going to be his servants. That's what happens when you have a king. And of course, that's what they get. Because even a good king, Solomon, good, it's always relative, right? He's a massive sinner and makes lots of mistakes. But a king like Solomon who does at least acknowledge God, still is a massively faulty king versus God who is ruling in a theocracy. So God does warn them of that very thing. Because kings, of course David is a king after God's own heart. Not everything he does was after, but that's how he started. He was a king after God's own heart, and even I just was thinking about that this week. Actually, I thought you could just take him fighting Goliath and juxtapose that with him forcing himself on Bathsheba, and you can just see the effect of unlimited power and resources on a person's soul. It makes you realize you don't really want that. You don't want to be rich and famous. Like, just, everybody wants to be like David fighting Goliath for the glory of God, and nobody wants to be like David forcing himself on Bathsheba and executing his own faithful friend Uriah. It's terrible. It's a horrible situation, and it's the effect of unlimited power on him. So no king, except King Jesus, can withstand the temptations and challenges of unlimited power like that, unlimited wealth. So yes, Solomon's guilty, David's guilty. Yeah. But I wouldn't say that they're just as bad as Xerxes, because a good example is in Israel. You have a list of, in Israel and Judah, as you walk through the history of them, you have good kings and bad kings, and kings that even God says these are awful and these are better. And so even among the sinful kings, there's still some good ones. Relatively good ones. And then there's just totally wicked ones. And so Xerxes falls in the totally wicked category. Solomon and David fall in the still super sinful, but better than these other kings. category, if that makes sense. So I wouldn't just throw them all in the same bucket. Just by saying they're all sinners doesn't mean they're all equally bad. So
Yeah. So this one ties back to the one regarding revering those in authority over you.
yeah,
And Mordecai didn't listen to the king's servants when they told him to revere Haman. So doesn't it look like he enticed Haman to harm all the Jews?
well, I'd say absolutely not there, because one, there is no such thing as enticing somebody to commit genocide. Like that's Haman. That's in Haman's corner. That's Haman's on Haman's shoulder. That's Haman's fault. It's wrong. It's absolutely wrong of Haman to do that. You know, Haman can't say the devil made me do it or Mordecai made me do it or anything else. It's absolutely wrong to order the genocide of an entire people just because you're offended. Could it be that Mordecai brought on some of the challenges himself by standing up for what he thought was right or whatever? Sure, but that doesn't mean that you can say he tempted Haman or brought on genocide on himself simply by doing what he did. That's I think that would be a jump. So is it possible Mordecai was wrong? Absolutely. Is it possible that Haman's act is excusable? No. If that makes sense.
Okay, last question because it's 106.
Okay.
With reference to this subject, I'm trying to figure out which one because sometimes they don't always come
Sure.
right on time. Can you comment on God's permissive will if there is such a thing considering God's omniscience?
Yeah. So I appreciate that question. So just because God overrules everything for good does not mean that everything is equally good. There are good things and there are evil things. It was wrong to nail to nail Jesus to the cross, and yet God overruled it for good. So God's permissive will is often it's used to talk about the way that God permits evil. God never causes evil. James says very clearly, God is not the author of sin. Don't ever blame God for your sin. God is holy. He's good. He never tempts anyone ever to sin. So we can never, even if we sin and something turns out okay, like say Peter denied Jesus and yet, Jesus gets crucified and then rises from the dead. Peter can't say, oh look, it was okay that I denied Jesus. No, just because God overrules it doesn't mean that it makes it okay. God does permit evil. He permits our free actions of our sinful hearts, and yet he does at the same time not allow us to undo his good with our evil. And so it's one thing for God to sovereignly do good. For instance, the way he saves sinners. He sovereignly sends his Holy Spirit through his word into the heart of sinful people and raises them from spiritual death, gives them life, and draws them to himself. And he does that sovereignly. He does that with his almighty power, and it's always effective. God never fails to save a sinner that he sends his Spirit into. And so he does it sovereignly, and he does it perfectly, right? He saves every single one of those people. That's him actively acting on his sovereign purposes. Then there's his permissive will, in which he is allowing Peter, for instance, to deny him. He tells him ahead of time he even warns him ahead of time, so he knows it's going to happen. But he allows Peter to deny him, but then overrules it in a beautiful way for good, by afterwards, turning to Peter and saying, as the resurrected Christ, he says, Peter, do you love me? Then feed my sheep. Do you love me? Feed my sheep. Do you love me? Feed my lambs. And so he is using even that failure in Peter's life to bring greater shepherding out of Peter in the future. So God overruling it doesn't mean that it excuses our sin, but he does accomplish his good purposes. So thank you for bringing up the permissive will. That's a good example.
Yeah, there's a couple more, but
okay.
Do you want to
yeah, thank you. That's wonderful. So thankful for all the good questions. Are they specifically on Esther 3?
Well, one is just
yeah,
kind of following up, so I feel
okay. Yeah,
so by not revering Haman, he brought a bad impression on all the Jews, because Esther 3:8 says, their laws are diverse from all people, neither keep they the king's laws. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it is possible that, this is absolutely true, that say a really belligerent, genuine Christian, but a belligerent Christian who's not full of grace, can bring a bad name on all Christians in the workplace or all Christians in the country or whatever. That certainly is true. It doesn't excuse anybody to commit genocide against all Christians. So just the fact that he might have been doing something wrong doesn't mean that it excuses Haman's wrongdoing. But absolutely, I mean, our best actions are often full of wrongdoing, so it's possible Mordecai made some wrong choices, but it still doesn't excuse Haman's sin.
Yeah.
So,
the other question, I'll just read it to you,
Yeah.
and you can decide if you want to answer
Okay.
it next week, because it is nice to have a question for the next week. Pastor Justin, what is your take on Philippians 1:18? Whatever it is Christ is preached for his glory.
yeah, that's great.
I think
Yeah, stay tuned until next week. That's a perfect one that we can use next week. We'll begin next week's with that question. So, and don't forget, next week we're going to be at 1 p.m. because we're going to be having 2 live in-person services beginning next week at church, and so we'll have to move the Q&A back. So the Q&A, show up if you can. If you're here in Toronto area, 9 a.m. and 11 a.m. will both be in-person services that you can attend. So please come. And secondly, because of that, we're going to move the Q&A time to 1 p.m. beginning next week. So join us next week at 1 p.m. and that's the question we'll be beginning with, which is a great question.
And I'm not going to start it with this ridiculous face.
Okay, I hope so. I hope she does. That'll be great. It'll be another great opportunity to. All right, God bless. Thanks so much.